Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I wanted to talk a little bit about why I don't really watch TV shows anymore. And when I say TV shows, I include things like Stranger Things on Netflix or The Mandalorian on Disney+. There are a lot of reasons not to watch these shows that are based entirely on quality, but there are also some reasons that have to do with the industry and the way it puts stuff together. Now, part of it is just that streaming services in general don't seem to be able to maintain a consistent standard of quality. Their goal seems to be to put together a product and get it out as fast as possible to keep people subscribed. That's not great, but that's not really what I want to address. What I want to get at actually predates the establishment of the streaming model and goes all the way back to one of the first really serious serial television productions, which is 24. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, but first I want to explain the forces in the industry that I think lead to this kind of stagnation that television has been dealing with for the past decade and a half to 2 decades. And to talk about that, we have to talk a little bit about copyright law, which I know sounds really super thrilling. But copyright law is a big part of how any IP holder monetizes what it creates. And it's an important part of understanding then how the industry looks at various kinds of IP. Copyright law is quite arcane and quite complicated, and I don't think anyone really understands it in its entirety. It requires a lot of judgment calls to look at something like The Witcher and say whether it is or is not copyright infringement when you relate it to something like Michael Moorcock's Elric series. I'm not here to talk about that question either. If you're really interested in that rabbit hole, Razorfist has a pretty good video on the subject. There are so many different elements in a work like The Witcher versus a work like Elric that it becomes difficult to relate them all to each other in a very clear-cut way. And a studio system that creates television shows wants to really avoid any kind of really complicated, arcane, deep noodling through that kind of copyright work. So television shows actually copyright a formula. And that formula actually encompasses a lot. For something very simple like a sitcom, a 2-camera sitcom, or even a 1-camera sitcom, it may include such details as the set, where the camera is located, how many actors are allowed to be on screen at once, and in a more general, broad sense, for a TV show like Star Trek The Original Series, it may relate to things like the appearance of the bridge, the general structure of an episode framed by captain's logs or personal logs, and etc. Now, if that sounds quite restrictive, do keep in mind you can deviate from your formula to a certain amount. You can have a couple of episodes every season that deviate wildly from that without voiding your copyright on a particular IP. You can also create a TV special which is related to your original property but deviates from its formula in a number of ways. We see this a lot in Doctor Who and in some sitcoms that want to have special events that take place in far-flung locations instead of the usual location of which is usually specified in the TV show's copyrighted formula. So there are a lot of ways to work around that. And of course, formulas are still pretty broad, and there's a lot of room for creative flexibility within your formula. Just look at a show like Stargate SG-1 or Star Trek, both of which had very clear-cut, well-defined formulas revolving around either a large crew or a small elite group of explorers going into weird and new situations. The real problem with the television show formula is that it creates a very strict and clear-cut status quo for the TV show that has to be maintained in order for that copyright to apply to it. Now, all of this is a pretty gross oversimplification of all the intricacies and nuances of the system, but I hope I have emphasized that studios are financially committed to maintaining a status quo in order to maintain the copyright that allows them to monetize their creations. This has, and assuming the copyright system remains as it is, probably always will force TV shows to maintain a certain amount of status quo. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. Star Trek, Stargate SG-1, plenty of other TV shows do a lot of work telling good stories contained within a single episode or with small narrative threads that tie them together, stretching across many seasons. Probably the best TV show for this was The X-Files in its early days. That show had a lot of ongoing narrative threads, and then every episode was kind of a investigation of the week formula that was quite compelling and presented you with good characters, good writing, for the most part, and engaged audiences with these longer plot threads. Of course, you could have shows that were entirely episodic, and of course the best example of that, as I have already suggested in discussing it up till this point, is the sitcom. Sitcoms have a status quo that they maintain almost religiously because that is the foundation of their humor. They are looking at a specific situation and wringing all of the humor out of it that they can. But then along comes Jack Bauer and the TV show 24. And I'm sure something like this was probably done on television before 24 was released. But I'm not familiar with it, and certainly it was 24 that made this deviation from the usual popular in the general consciousness. So 24 comes along, and they introduce a consistent, tightly written, highly narratively relevant plot through line to the entire series. If you're not familiar with 24, a quick recap, it was about a federal agent going through the longest day of his life, where every hour of the episode covers an hour of real time for the characters. And it was quite a good TV show by all accounts. I've never actually watched 24, any season of it from start to finish, but people whose opinions I value on this really enjoyed 24 and thought it was a pretty good TV show, telling a new kind of story to audiences that were looking for a new kind of experience. And it was a little bit like a series of 3 or 4 movies all run together across the course of a TV season. Very interesting, very successful, and very influential to television going forwards. The problem was 24 and all the narratively driven TV shows that followed in its wake are still bound by the same kind of copyright law that applies to regular television. And furthermore, was still written by people who were brought up in this system and had to earn their chops in this system, and still thought in terms of maintaining a status quo. There were several seasons of 24, and they all followed the same formula. Start at the beginning of a day, follow it to its conclusion, and while there is no status quo across the season, at the end of every season, a status quo is returned to. So Jack will go through a long trial and then come back to a status quo situation, and he's introduced in a very similar status quo situation at the beginning of the next season. This is because the heart of television copyright is this formula that creates a status quo. The need to recreate that state of normalcy at the end of every season does strip some of the power from the storytelling. One of my favorite Netflix series of the last 5 years was Lost in Space. But even there, while it has a very strong narrative through line, and the characters begin in different situations at the beginning of every season, you can still see the formula at work. Every season begins with the Robinsons isolated from the space colonists they were traveling with. And then they reunite with the space colonists, and they solve a bunch of problems, and they move on to the next location. That's a good formula. It's a solid formula for a story, but seeing the same characters go through it time and again does begin to strain believability a little bit. I think Lost in Space did pretty well in its last season, and I may talk about that and the show overall in another video. But the point here is, by the time they hit the end, they were beginning to strain credibility just a little bit. How many times can these people get split up and stranded apart from each other and still come back together intact? How long can we hang out with these characters in the same kind of situations and not want to see them doing something else? And I think a big part of what helped a series like 24 run for so long, outside of being one of the few series that was trying to do that kind of narrative storytelling at the time, was the fact that it was stretched out over a great deal of time. It ran across 24 weeks, actually more like 26 or 28 when you took into account some of the breaks that were worked in for holidays and the like. So you didn't seem to sense that repetitiveness to the same extent you do when you consume something dropped on Netflix, and that you can just binge through in a couple of weeks, or even 2 or 3 days if you are really gung-ho about the way you consume your media. Stretching out a highly repetitive story can help hide the fact that it is so repetitive, because people are busy. They don't have as much time to think about the show over the course of 28 weeks as they would in a binge session. Their full mind is not looking at the narrative with quite the same level of scrutiny. And that's really not a credit to the writing or construction here, but it is just a reality that it took, I think, a little bit longer than maybe it should have to notice this problem with repetitiveness in these serialized shows. No matter what the cause, I think that for myself, as someone who enjoys consuming stories and following characters to a number of different places and in a number of different situations and seeing how they will react to them and getting all these different angles of insight into their character and their world and how they react to situations in them and the kinds of situations that exist around them, the repetitiveness that is enforced by the current formulaic nature of copyright law surrounding television shows is kind of a drag. I know some of this is the fault of the writers. Restrictions actually help you be more creative because they allow you to focus in on certain variables and flex them as far as they can go. However, even with that kind of mindset, which I have to admit I don't see in a lot of writers today, even with that kind of mindset, there's only so far you can take a successful TV show within the limits of the formula that is given in modern copyright law. And I think at some point, if they want to make really great, really engaging, multifaceted stories again in a television format, they are going to have to look at some of the other tricks they can play, like creating spin-offs or having specials. A great example is actually the Del Toro animated series that came out on Netflix, each focusing on a different set of central characters in a shared world and giving us a sense of the breadth and depth of the world they are in. But even those shows were still pretty formulaic once you got underneath the surface there. So some promise there, certainly a direction you could go, but I don't think they've cracked the problem yet. And until they do, I have a really hard time getting invested in a long-running television series. And I only have so much time to consume media. There are a lot of books I want to read. There are a lot of comics I want to read and or draw. And there are, of course, stories I want to write for myself. So getting invested in a long-running television series that I know is going to be the same thing basically season to season and is not going to really dig into that basic concept and explore it with the depth that television used to do when episodic content was the norm and writers really had to think about how they were interacting with that formula and the different things they could show off with it. I mean, I just don't see how it's worth time right now. So this is why I don't really watch television, and it's why I do kind of hope to see some improvements in this area, but I don't plan to go back to it until people really start thinking about these hurdles that they face and how they are going to overcome them. It is true that there is a dearth of creativity in Hollywood right now, and that manifests itself in a bunch of different ways. But I think that the place where I would like to see creativity return the most is in how we approach the structures that surround our stories and how we interact with them. Because right now we are doing it at a very basic, very middle school creative writing assignment level. A professional writer can take a middle school creative writing assignment and give you a polished, engaging, gripping story. And a middle schooler can take a brilliant, high-concept television series pitch and give you a very bland, repetitive, uninteresting story. That's not a knock on junior high students. I don't expect them to be able to write at the same level as a Hollywood writer. But when we have that level of writing in Hollywood, the major hurdles that Hollywood faces just don't get addressed. Anyway, that's all I've got for you today. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Tell me what your favorite high continuity, high narrative TV show series is down in the comments below, and I'll talk to you later.